My name is Becky Battergall. I'm Associate Professor in the Faculty of Law and an Associate at MSDI. I want to start by acknowledging the Aboriginal people of the Kulin Nations on whose land Monash, across all of its Victorian campuses, is situated. I want to pay my respects to Kulin elders, past and present. I think when we're talking about connecting social inclusion, sustainable development, Indigenous perspectives in Australia, absolutely crucial to our understanding of not only of what is fair, but how we can go about creating sustainable society. Today, I'm really excited to welcome Eliza Venville to present her work on victim survivors' experiences on water utility reforms in Victoria. I think Eliza's work is really crucial for thinking about how we connect the environmental SDG goals around water, land and climate to some of the social inclusion SDGs around poverty, equality and gender. Eliza is a research assistant at Monash Sustainable Development Institute, and as of next week will be a PhD student at Monash University. Eliza's presentation today focuses on, is a result of the collaboration between Monash Sustainable Development Institute and the Faculty of Law, and it presents her honours work that she did in 2020. Today. It's unusual to have an honours student presenting her work somewhat before she's even started her PhD, but I think the quality of what Eliza is doing by going and speaking to marginalised Victorians about their experience and thinking about how we can incorporate that experience into solving some of the sustainable development problems is key for us in thinking about how we do sustainable development in Australia and nationally. So Eliza is a recent graduate of Monash University, and her PhD, which will commence next week, will continue her work exploring the connection between essential services industry, social equity and community-wide family violence sector response. We are recording today and we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, so you can put questions in chat which we'll respond to at the end, or you can raise your virtual or real hand when we get there. Welcome, Eliza. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Becky, and thanks for inviting me to speak today. It's a real honour to be a part of such a wonderful and important presentation series. I will go ahead and share my screen. Is that working for everyone?
All good.
Great. Before I get stuck into it, I'd really like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land I'm presenting from today. That's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I want to acknowledge that sovereignty over this land was never ceded. So as Becky mentioned, the research that I'll be talking through today was completed around a year ago, and it formed the honours component of my arts law degree here at Monash. As always, I'd like to give a special thanks to my spectacular supervisors, Becky and Paul Sater, in his absence today. Trouble changing, there we go. There's no doubt that in Australia, family violence is a national crisis. 1 in 6 Australian women over the age of 15 have experienced physical or sexual violence at the hands of a current or former partner. And unfortunately, that's as good as your odds get here as a woman in Australia. The prevalence of family violence is higher for women belonging to culturally and linguistically diverse communities, women living with disabilities, and it's significantly higher for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. On average, Australian police receive a family violence call every 2 minutes, which means that in the time that we've got here together over the next hour, police will be called about 30 times. And Something that makes this statistic even more staggering is the fact that only 18% of victim survivors have ever called police for a family violence incident. Before I go any further, I think it's really important to point out that while my presentation will focus on the experience of victim survivor women in heterosexual relationships, the experience of family violence is by no means limited to these relationships. There's a real dearth of data when it comes to the experience of LGBT victim survivors. But the limited data that we do have shows us that people in queer relationships are at least equally or maybe more likely to experience family violence than people in heterosexual relationships. And despite this prevalence, LGBT people remain largely invisible in family violence policy and practice. My research was victim survivor led, and because the particular participants I interviewed didn't belong to LGBT communities, the experience of LGBT victim survivors was not a focus of this research. But this was absolutely not intended to erase the very valid and important experiences of these people. When we think about family violence, we commonly think of physical and sexual violence. But in reality, there's just so many ways that a person can manipulate someone else to exercise power and control. The focus of my research was economic abuse. Now, economic abuse is coercive or deceptive behaviour designed to manipulate a person's access to money or financial security to perpetuate a cycle of dependence and maintain power and control. I'll give you some examples of what economic abuse can look like. It could be restricting someone's access to bank accounts or cards. It could be withholding information about joint finances or assets. It could be forcing someone to take on sole legal liability for jointly incurred debts. And it can even be coercing someone into claiming social security payments. It's a subtle and insidious form of family violence, which is buried in normalised patterns of gendered social behaviour around money making and money handling, which makes it incredibly hard to identify. In my experience speaking with friends and family about the research that I've been doing, the impact of economic abuse is often all too easily underestimated. So in this research, I interviewed, among other participants, victim survivors of economic abuse, and each of them gave raw and devastating accounts of this form of abuse and its implications. Sarah, which is not her real name, experienced years of physical, sexual, emotional, and economic abuse at the hands of her former husband. She had no credit card. She was forbidden from having a bank account, no mobile phone, and wasn't allowed to work. She had a 1-year-old child, and she told me that every time her husband would leave the house, which he would sometimes do for days at a time, she was absolutely terrified that something would happen to her child and she would be powerless to do anything about it. She couldn't call anyone. She couldn't go out and buy anything that she needed. She couldn't catch an Uber. And I think that Sarah's story really shows us just how crippling and dehumanizing this form of abuse can be. She described economic abuse like this. He was controlling everything. He was handling everything and the money. That's how they keep their monopoly. That's how they keep their control over us. So what's the connection between economic abuse and water utilities? To understand this connection, I want you to think about your morning so far today. Maybe you had a cup of tea or coffee. I hope you brushed your teeth. Maybe you made a meal for yourself or your kids. You might have stacked or unstacked the dishwasher. If you're working from home, maybe you even had a chance to put some family washing on. Without water, none of these tasks would be possible. National data collected in May this year tells us that Australian women are significantly more likely to be tasked with household duties and carry far more of the domestic burden than men. This means that access to water services disproportionately impacts women, and women are also more likely to experience economic abuse. To help us understand, we can frame the family violence water utility connection in terms of the UN SDGs. The SDGs that are especially relevant to this research are SDGs 5, gender equality, 6, clean water and sanitation, and 10, reduced inequalities. The connection between SDG 5 and 6 has gained significant traction in the international arena, primarily in the water, sanitation, and hygiene context. If we look just that bit more closely and understand that water is essential to domestic life in Australia in 2021, and that women bear the bulk of the domestic burden in Australia in 2021, then the connection between SDG 5 and 6 is clear in our own backyards too. Economic abuse, which is a gendered issue, is relevant to water utilities because perpetrators can manipulate water accounts, bills, and debts to commit economic abuse. In this context, it could look like placing a debt into someone's sole name, despite the debt being jointly incurred or sometimes even solely incurred by the perpetrator. It could also be refusing to allow payment of bills so that debts accumulate, which creates problems for accessing credit later down the line. SDG 10 comes into play because my research is about reducing barriers for victim survivor customers by ensuring that water utility policies are inclusive of the unique needs of this customer group. In 2017, the Essential Services Commission made pretty significant changes to the way that water utilities are expected to respond to customers impacted by family violence. Now, the Essential Services Commission is the body that regulates water, energy, and transport in Victoria. Some of the changes that were made included making family violence training for water utility customer service staff compulsory, facilitating access to existing utility hardship programs for victim survivor customers, and making customer referrals to specialist family violence services. These reforms were the first of their kind, and they really did place the Victorian water sector at the heart of a community-wide effort to end family violence in Australia. 2 years later, the Commission conducted a review, which is that document that I've got on the right of the screen. Now, this review interviewed family violence advocates, specialist family violence organisations, and financial counsellors to try and get a sense of how effective the changes had been. Were they working is basically the question that the review asked. It's a thorough review. I read it cover to cover, but something that the review didn't do was seek feedback directly from victim survivor customers about their experiences. So the victim survivor voice, despite family violence affected customers being at the centre of these policy changes, were excluded from this review process. In this research, I argued that victim survivor-led research is absolutely essential when we're talking about family violence policy changes. And this is the gap that my research aimed to fill. So what did I do? I conducted 8 interviews in total. I interviewed 4 victim survivors, 1 victim survivor's friend, and 3 professionals, including 2 water sector professionals and a legal practitioner working in the space. Victim survivor voices were triangulated against the voices of the professional participants and the findings of the Essential Services Commission 2019 review. We faced a number of recruitment challenges in this project. Victim survivors are known for being a hard to reach group, and this idea absolutely rang true for me in this project. And I think the challenges on this front were undoubtedly exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Recruitment was happening in July 2020, which is just about when the second big lockdown in Melbourne and Victoria was happening last year. So with all that in mind, it's very likely that victim survivors had even less time or willingness to speak to me at that time. And also if people were currently experiencing family violence, with everyone being locked in their homes, it's very likely that they weren't in a safe position to do so. Another challenge is that it was likely that I was trying to recruit a very narrow pool of participants. At the time of interviewing, the changes had only been on foot for about 2 years. So people had to have experienced troubles with their water account because of family violence within that 2-year period. Eventually though, I did find people to speak to, and I am ever grateful to the women who shared their most personal stories with me in the hope of creating change. So what did I find? I found that there was a very limited understanding that water utilities even have support options for family violence affected customers. None of the victim survivors I interviewed were aware that their water utility had support there for them. Now, you could say that this isn't altogether surprising given the recency of the changes, but what it does suggest is that there is work to be done to raise community awareness around the types of support that's available for victim survivor customers. Because how can we expect people to ask for something that they don't know is there? It also suggests that until then, water utility family violence support provision must be premised on the basis that economic abuse and other kinds of family violence cases won't be obvious. Because if customers aren't aware there's support, they're very unlikely to ask for help. As well as this unawareness, some people I spoke with even expressed the belief that water utilities actively don't want to know about their customers' experiences of family violence. Helen, again, not her real name, said, "The person answering the phone doesn't know about family violence. These people don't want to get involved. They sounded like they were well out of their depth." Of course, this is a small sample, which can't be deemed representative, but what it does do is really suggest that community misconceptions about the role of utilities in responding to family violence do exist. And again, it highlights the work yet to be done to increase community awareness around family violence support services available to water customers. Another big finding of this research was that victim survivors received inconsistent assistance depending on their situation. So where a customer disclosed their experience of family violence, they received excellent help. Even though water issues were often quite a small part of what was going on for them, the people I spoke with made it clear that the help made a massive difference. This was especially true when they were referred to family violence specialist services and financial counselling. On the other hand, where a customer didn't or couldn't disclose family violence, they received little assistance at all. Another woman I interviewed, who I'll call Catherine, lived in a violent relationship for years. When she and her partner eventually separated and her partner moved out of the home, he put a water account into her name. When her friend called Catherine's water utility to get help with this, her friend didn't use the words family violence, but what she did do was say that there'd been a recent separation and that Catherine hadn't consented to this account being put in her name. Catherine told me that she really felt like her water utility didn't understand the significance of this. She said, "They said there was nothing they could do about it. There was no investigation." The innumerable barriers to disclosure of family violence have been well documented. These barriers can include feelings of shame and stigma, as well as fears about confidentiality and safety, and fundamentally the fear of not being believed. Where economic abuse is concerned, the person experiencing the abuse often doesn't even realise they are. More needs to be done to support water utility frontline staff to assist customers regardless of whether they disclose family violence or not. Customers like Catherine. Because fundamentally, non-disclosure just shouldn't be a barrier to effective support. We need services, especially essential services like water, that wrap around customers. The third and final finding I'll leave you with today is the problem I found with third-party debt collection. Interviews show that the status of a customer's debt really impacted the support received. Where a customer's debt had already been passed to third-party collectors, the customer wasn't able to receive support from their water company. This is because the guidelines governing the operation of debt collectors in Australia don't yet recognise family violence as a form of financial hardship. This means that family violence affected customers are rendered ineligible for hardship support unless they can satisfy some other criteria. This is really concerning because my interviews showed that it's not at all uncommon for victim survivor customers to accumulate enormous debt and therefore have their debts moved on to third-party collectors. This finding is a real opportunity for utilities to review current debt collection arrangements and ensure that customer debts are only transferred to collectors with a family violence policy. And in the research, I argue that to do less would seriously threaten the integrity of water utility family violence policies and undermine the industry's commitment to their victim survivor customers. Based on these findings, we made 5 key recommendations for reform. The first is that increased efforts must be made by water utilities to raise community awareness of the support measures available for family violence affected customers. Secondly, family violence awareness and risk assessment training for frontline customer service staff must teach staff to identify and respond to economic abuse. And economic abuse should be carved out as different from family violence in this sense. To support this training, we recommended the development of an inter-industry risk assessment tool for identifying economic abuse. The tool would assist customer service staff training and improve family violence support provision in cases where the customer doesn't or it's not safe for them to disclose family violence. This tool could be something used by the entire essential services industry. Water utilities should also only be permitted to sell customer debts to debt collectors with a family violence policy. To do this, utilities will need to investigate their current arrangements. And finally, we suggest that an inter-industry risk assessment tool should be established to share knowledge and solve problems. Because the reality is that these issues are not confined to the water sector. We're seeing them everywhere. And the best way to solve this enormous problem is to work together on this and share the knowledge that has been gained so far. So while the water sector has made extremely significant inroads in addressing the problem of family violence, there's still more to do, and making the changes that we've suggested based on the experience of victim survivor customers will go a really long way in better supporting them. Before I finish, I wanted to talk a bit about the impact of this research and the future directions that I see for it. So how has this research made a difference so far? The intended impact, or the aim, I suppose, was to share victim survivor perspectives on a recent family violence water policy change. I hope to provide feedback to water utilities, let them know what's working, what's not, so that they can improve their service delivery. I also hope that these incredibly valuable victim survivor insights could be utilised to help establish new benchmarks for family violence service provision across the essential services industry. And above all, I really hope to demonstrate how important and how valuable victim survivor voices are. And that not only is victim survivor-led research a good option when it comes to family violence policy change, that it's really the only way to ensure that the changes are sustainable and responsive to need. So the story so far. Well, to this end, I've so far made 2 law reform submissions to 2 national inquiries. So last year I submitted submissions to the National Water Reform and the Inquiry into Family, Domestic and Sexual Violence. In May this year, I was fortunate to have the opportunity to present my findings at the National Water Conference, Ozwater, which was held in Adelaide. I loved my time there and I made some wonderful connections with some really inspiring and really passionate water sector leaders. I'm happy to say that we have stayed in touch, and through these ongoing relationships, we're already seeing change. After my presentation at the conference, a senior manager at a leading New South Wales water utility sent me an email to let me know that they've been looking into their debt collection arrangements and they're trying to improve safety nets for customers. Just last month, I recorded a podcast for Barwon Water, which is one of Victoria's water utilities, in their Customer Experience Week. After which I received some feedback that they're going to look into how they can add economic abuse, a focus on economic abuse, to their existing family violence training. So the wheels are well and truly in motion, and it's really exciting to see these partnerships and collaborations and how these partnerships are growing and will produce real change. Looking to the future, so this project was obviously very small scale, but this was appropriate given it's the very first academic evaluation of the water sector family violence changes and the only evaluation so far to leverage victim survivor voices. And I guess while this project is finished, my interest and commitment to this space is really just beginning. As Becky mentioned at the beginning, on Monday, I'll be starting a PhD here at Monash, which is going to continue my work in this space and trying to understand even further at the intersection between essential services, social equity, and family violence. So watch this space. It's been great to speak with you today, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Eliza. While people are thinking about some questions or comments or observations they may have, and thank you for your acknowledgement there from the audience. Just what Eliza didn't mention, and what I didn't mention earlier, is that we just found out this week that she's a finalist in the Student Water Prize in the Victorian Awards, and we'll find out early next year how that goes. But I think it's real testament to Eliza's work and her connection to her commitment to making a difference, and doing that through her connection with industry. And I can see that we've got Cameron from Bowen Water here, and that's I just think that connection is really important. It's the key way that we escape the ivory tower syndrome. Has anyone got any questions or comments? You can welcome to pop them into chat, or while people are thinking, I'm going to ask you a question, Eliza. You've talked about how water utilities can respond to customers who are experiencing one of our significant problems, which is family violence. And you focused on Victoria. I'm wondering if you think your work has relevance, and what that relevance is to other customers in Victoria, but also the other water users, if we think in a national, international context. How water businesses and water providers can respond to other types of problems, if there's lessons from your work.
Thanks, Becky. Thanks for the question. Yes, I think about that often. I think it was really important in this instance to focus on victim survivor customers, given that we were looking at those family violence changes. But I think when we think about intersectionality, there's so many different factors that make things hard for people who are trying to seek help. So family violence is just one thing that can cause people to experience vulnerability, but I absolutely think that this research has lessons for other groups within the community too. And I think that, the real power of this research is speaking to the people who are being affected. And I do think that we could learn a lot about what different facets of the community need by simply asking them. It's not always easy to do, and I certainly learned that lesson in this research, but I think just because something's not easy, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it. So I think, yes, that there's so much scope for future research to look into how we can better serve the community as a whole. And I think the best way to do that is to ask people.
Cameron.
Thank you. Great presentation, Eliza. It's some really interesting and a little bit confronting, some of the information, but it was really valuable. So I appreciate that. One question I had just in the early part of your presentation, you were talking about customers that weren't aware that water utilities could were there to support, and that's certainly something that we see operationally from day to day, that there's a strong need to educate our customers that water utilities are there to support them. I was just wondering if you've given any thought to how what a good solution might look like in that space, to try and help us get a little bit more reach and awareness within the community.
Thanks, Cameron, and thanks again for coming along today. It means a lot that you've made the effort to come along and being part of the conversation. Yeah, I think this is a really tricky one, because, as I mentioned, as well as the fact that this lack of awareness is a really big problem, victim survivor customers, and I'm sure the same is true for other more marginalised customers, they're really hard to get in contact with. And there's so many reasons why people can be a bit disengaged. And in the family violence context, you know, if we're talking about even if we were to send communications to addresses or mobile numbers, the reality is that they're frequently changing for victim survivors because there's a need to preserve that information, to preserve their safety and the safety of children if they have children. So there's a big challenge there. I actually asked this question of some of the professional participants I interviewed, and there were some interesting ideas. Some were that kind of focusing on how could we embed this information with the comms that already go out to customers. So whether that's in a push text that kind of goes out every month or on bills. But I think it's what we're talking about really, I think, is cultural change as well. This understanding that family violence isn't just a problem for family violence services. It's a problem for us all, and it's the responsibility of us all to look out for each other, really. So I think it's a big question. There was also talk of how could we, participation in, I guess, some kind of community events or some kind of presence by water utilities in community events. That's been obviously very hard over the last 18 months of the pandemic because there really haven't been any community events in that same way. I don't know. I think it's a big question. Also, the idea of advertising in family violence centres or financial counselling centres would be something to consider. I suppose we've got to think about, where are these people going to be and where might they just happen upon the information? Because given what they're going through, I don't think we can expect them to find it themselves. So I think it's a great question, and, you know, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too, if you had any about that.
So just very quickly, I know there's some other questions coming through. Absolutely. I think my view is it does intersect with a lot of the other things you're talking about around, you know, making sure that staff are well trained, making sure that, you know, the right support networks are there, because in reality our frontline staff aren't experts in everything, and we need to make sure we're able to support them to have the right conversation and then ensure we try and do the right thing by the customer. So I think the cultural change part is probably the really important one there, and just across, I'm talking industry wide here, where it just becomes, you know, part of our DNA, I guess, part of, you know, just what we do as part of our customer interactions, and just having that level of awareness. But I think you're right. It's not a straightforward one, but it is a challenge that we grapple with, is around how we continue to increase our reach and make customers aware. But good that it's noted, and I think that's a really important first step to help us sort of create some good strategic plans to help increase our reach and awareness. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Cam.
Thanks, Cameron. Lisa.
Thanks, Becky. Well done, Eliza. It's fascinating research, really interesting. I had the great privilege recently of being involved in some of the consultation work that Monash was doing to inform the next national plan to reduce violence against women and children, and was really impressed to see a lot of the work that the banking sector are doing in this area. They're really, I'd have to say, leading the way. I was working at Our Watch when a lot of this work was starting, and so we had a lot of early conversations with the banks, and it's really quite surprising to see how far they've come in a long way. But one of the things that they have found, and I think is a really tangible way that they've been able to assist victims of domestic and family violence, is they found that perpetrators were using banking systems and processes as a form of abuse. So they'd make little 5-cent sort of transactions, deposits into women's accounts, accompanied by abusive messages. Now the banks are generally really aware of that, and they're constantly looking at, when new technologies are being developed, how, you know, they might be able to be misused or have unintended consequences. I'm just wondering if you came across anything like that with the water companies, and whether or not that might be something that could be looked at.
As in the use of technology? Yes, that's a great question, Lisa. I didn't come across anything like that in my research. That's certainly not to say that they don't. Yes, it was it was kind of small project over a couple of months, so I didn't by any means get a complete thorough sense of every little thing that water utilities are doing. But that's not the sense I got, but I think it's an interesting idea, and I don't know whether Cam could shed some light on this too, not to put you on the spot, but I think that it's an interesting one of how you could code something, or what would you ask this AI, I suppose, this program to look for, because it can look so different.
Yeah, I just wonder if there might be signs that could be looked for in data around missed payments or transfers of accounts across names or something like that, because I know banks and obviously water companies and electricity companies have an awful lot of data, and the banks have found it quite a useful way to identify where there might be problems and where technology and banking procedures might be being used by perpetrators as a form of abuse.
I can quickly add, I agree. Like I've also personally I've sort of had some experience working in the banking sector as well. And I'd say that the level of data they hold is probably slightly more sophisticated than say what we do. But having said that, yes, there's absolutely some key triggers, and through the use of insights and analytics and advanced analytics that can potentially help us proactively identify potential risk areas. It may be things like change of ownership or change of accounts or change of payment details or payment fluctuations in payments. So I absolutely think there's that's certainly an avenue to explore without any doubt.
Thanks, Lisa. That was great.
I just want to acknowledge Lisa's own PhD work on victim survivors and impact on policy is really significantly contributing to our knowledge. Naomi had a question. Thanks, Naomi.
Thanks. Very, very much related to Lisa's question. But first, thanks for an amazing presentation, Eliza. It was amazing to see you present at that conference last year and again here today. There's just incredible findings that you've got, and it's really important to be sharing it. So well done. I guess, my question was, do you think your findings would apply to other utilities in the same way? We've just been talking about banks, but other utilities like electricity or mobile phone bills or mortgages, that kind of thing. And no worries if the scope of your research was just on water, but.
Thanks, Naomi, and it's great to see you here again. You were at Water, so you got this very similar presentation twice, so thanks for coming along again. I think the simple answer is yes, it would apply in the same, or at least a very similar way. But I think the big difference and this is to the best of my knowledge, this was kind of outside the scope of what I was looking at in this research, is that the response can be vastly different. And there is a kind of, even in the victim survivors I spoke with, there was this sense that, I had a good experience with water, or I didn't have a great experience with water, but the water experience is significantly better than the experience that you get when you ring up your telco or whoever. So I think the issues are the same. I think it's that same, the power and control, manipulating accounts, manipulating flow of money, restricting access to money is the same. But I think unfortunately, water sector and the banks are leading the way, and potentially others are really lagging behind. And there's a lot more work to be done in other spaces.
Thanks.
Shireen, thanks, Shireen.
Thanks, Eliza, for a very clear and interesting presentation, and all the best in starting your PhD journey from next week. I was actually curious to see if the types of reforms that we have seen here with water utilities getting more involved with family violence issues, are there other models internationally that similar reforms have happened? And if yes, has there been any published research or documentation on that can actually give us some insights or lessons that we might be able to adapt for our context here in Australia?
Thanks, Shireen. Great question. I actually got this question the other week when I presented to the MSDI water group. Brian asked this exact question, so you're on the same wavelength. I haven't unfortunately looked into it since then, and I actually don't really know what's going on internationally in this space. I think that will be a really fascinating place to even start thinking in the PhD journey, but to the best of my knowledge, I actually don't know. I'm not sure if, Becky, you might know about banking internationally, or can.
There's a little bit of work in the US on banking, but in a less regulated country, it's not as centralized as here. And I don't know about water nor other essential services. But certainly when we've looked at the Australian literature, I think the Victorian water sector is leading the way on this. And the Essential Services Commission, their work is the first study on this, and we haven't seen any other academic work, and certainly no one else has done victim survivor-led work, as Eliza said.
Great question, though, and I'm keen to look into that.
Oh, excellent foundation for a PhD.
Yeah, indeed.
Rob.
Yeah, hi, Eliza. Thank you very much for a very good presentation. And this is a topic I'm certainly not an expert in. But I was wondering if you could maybe reflect if there are any potential risks or limitations of tasking some of these organizations, or some of these sectors are sort of commercially driven organizations, maybe not the water sector so much, but if you go into mobile phone companies or mortgage servicing companies, their core business is making money. And I wonder if there are limits to what can be expected in that context to essentially address something that's a very public problem in a way where governments should perhaps be much stronger involved in. Can you provide some reflections on that?
I love that question, Rob. That is a question that keeps me up at night in the best of ways. I find it so interesting to think about what can we genuinely expect of corporations whose fundamental duty is to maximize value for shareholders, if we accept that. I think Becky and I have certainly had conversations about this. I think, again, something I'm really interested to explore, I think a way that essential services could potentially be carved out from that, and talking specifically about the ones that are privatized. So you mentioned telecommunications, but energy, for example, is another one, is maybe, I don't know the answer, but I think maybe could it be argued that we can expect more from a corporation whose duty is to provide essential services to the community? So maybe we couldn't expect the same from some other type of corporation, but maybe we could say that energy, telecommunications, for example, and banks, for example, maybe they could be held to a different standard. But I think, yeah, there would certainly be opposition to this idea that there's an actual obligation of corporations to, I suppose, ensure that their policies and practices don't disadvantage certain marginalised groups in the community. But I think it's a really fascinating question. And yeah, I think we are seeing more of a shift in recent years to expect more from our corporations, but I'm fascinated by that question. And thank you for asking it, because I'm really looking forward to looking into that more.
Can I add to that? And Robert, it's a question that's totally on the money. And I think what we're seeing with COP26 is, particularly from our own country, is where we're getting private organisations leading the way in changing policy on climate change. And I think how we think about corporations has been quite narrow for some time, thinking about just maximising shareholder value, but there's a whole stream of thought about, you know, from triple bottom line to corporate social responsibility to corporate license to operate, to thinking about what corporations do and don't do. And I think that there is a real case to be argued in sustainable development sense that this is not just about environmental concerns, but also thinking about the whole pantheon of sustainable development challenges, which includes social inclusion, exclusion, marginalisation, and economic development, and unequal economic development, that's part of what corporations do in societies now. I just note Lisa's comment there, that some of the problems that banks are dealing with are around perpetrators in the workplace, same with the police force, and some aspects of the public service too. It's a really astute comment. Any other last comments or questions?
I might just add, if I can, Becky, that Eliza, I'd love to catch up with you and have a chat about your research more at some time. But I've actually just been looking at risks and limitations of victim survivors co-creating and co-producing public value in government. And I don't think we should forget that the state is a source of power, and a source, you know, a place, all institutions, and perhaps particularly even more so political institutions, have severely embedded gender imbalances, power imbalances. And I just think that it's interesting that we see this dichotomy between public and private. But I think particularly when I've interviewed the most marginalised kind of victim survivors, so Aboriginal, Maori women, women with intellectual disabilities, the state is certainly not a benign force for them.
Awesome
Yes.
comment.
Thank you, Lisa. And I'd love to catch up with you too.
Well, please join me in thanking Eliza for the excellent presentation today. The recording is, of course, available on MSDI's website. And I also want to thank May Wee for your help in setting up and organising the series. Thank you very much. Great to see you here, everyone.